This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought, and to debate. Brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. If you like us, please consider joining our community of supporters by giving to our Patreon campaign. You'll find it on your homepage. I'm your co-hostess, Dahlia Scheindlin.
And I'm the co-host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we'll be talking about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. Our guest today is Joshua Simon. He's a writer, editor, and curator. He's the former chief curator and director of the Museum of Bat Yam, who will, at the end of May, moderate a roundtable discussion at the Van Leer Institute dedicated to the nature and impact of political art in contemporary Israel. Isn't art always political? And when it's not, it's just bad art? And what's the role of art in shaping our political outlook when the Israeli reality offers little escape from politics? These questions and more will be at the center of our discussion today. Joshua Simon, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So you write in your presentation that political art is one that draws from the world of current events. And in the context of Israeli art, to be labeled political, does it have to deal one way or another with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the occupation?
When I write this, I mean to say that this is how we recognize political art, but it can have actually many other ways of presenting itself. So drawing from like images from TV and so on, I would argue first of all that, TV channels in Israel are owned by these people who have very strong ties to the government, of course, but also that cross through the economy on different levels and industries other than media. So they are not solely, apart from Haaretz, I guess, they're not only owners of a newspaper, but they have other interests. So whatever image you're seeing there and then you're using in your art as political art, you should take that into account. And the other media outlets are either controlled by the government directly or by the military. And therefore, again, the images that you will find to work with, describing the reality that you would like to critique maybe, it's very narrow, that kind of image bank to begin with.
Okay, I have to ask you a few questions about this. First of all, is there any Western democracy in the world where the major media are not controlled by large-scale corporate owners from the private sector who are, by definition, close to government figures? I mean, is that really unique to Israel?
I guess not at all. But when you say Western democracies, I would call these, procedural democracies, so-called democracies, self-proclaimed democracies. I'm far from being a follower of whatever systems these are and, how great they're doing.
I wasn't saying that to laud them so much as to say that even in Western democracies, by contrast to, really repressive regimes, we have media. We think the media is independent, but we also know that it's beholden to corporate and political interests everywhere.
I can put it in a very simple way. They talk about fake news today. Come on. Fake news didn't start today.
You communist, you know something about fake news.
Precisely.
Because I mean to say that the news is fake news by definition, being that this is the structure.
But I have to ask you then, because in Israel and in some other places, we have lots of other opportunities for alternate media. In fact, we have a channel called The Real News.
And you mentioned Haaretz newspaper.
Exactly. And we live in an era of the internet and social media that allows things like our podcast. If we don't like the old news, we create our own nowadays.
And actually, it leads me to perhaps a more principled question, and that is about the contours of what is political. You seem to depart from the premise that political art or political manifestations are all in some way tied to political power, to the government and the powers that be. But then again, isn't that exactly the role of art, of political art, to focus on the subversive potential of the political, if you
And now that we have 7 questions going, let me just add another one. Just kidding.
There are so many different categories we can apply, but let's go just for the technological one on the one hand, and then I'll give like an example from old masters, okay? Like from art history. So I don't know if you know this. I mean, 2018 will be remembered for many things, I guess. But one of them is also the shortage of graphic cards. You know, like stuff that gamers or graphic designers buy. Because it works very fast on, putting images, whatever, rendering and so on. But the idea I'm trying to convey here is this. We work in the visual, okay? Artists, curators, but actually power inhabits sub-visual world. It's not attainable to our sight. And that is metadata, algorithms, derivatives, DNA manipulation. Okay, so when we speak of, political art, we have to also think of actually the field of the visual and how it can, or how does it report on those sub-visual realities that actually make our world.
Are you talking about the means of production and base and throughput structure here?
I'm just saying that, we used to show, Frank Capra would show a soldier falling from a bullet in the Civil War in Spain, and that would be an image that, explains to, in one image you can see, like, the story. First of all, there's no one image. Also, Tiananmen, like, that's one of the last images
There are
that
even
show...
accusations that is a staged photograph, I don't think they're true, but we've always doubted the veracity of the visual image.
Okay, yes. But then again, why do we trust that sub-visual, that just dictates our life? So I think the challenge is for art and for all, people working within the visual is to find ways to make work that, has political kind of agency in relation to this kind of structure that we are in now. And to give an example from the old masters, okay, so there are many examples, but just there's a poem by Oden that actually they teach in Israeli schools. It's called The Old Masters. And basically he's walking in the museum and he's saying, what's so amazing about these painters is that even when they give you this idyllic image, you also know that somewhere there's a catastrophe going on. So I think that giving an account of, everything that's going on, while it can be, an image of a flower. Here we have this flower-shaped...
Ladies and gentlemen, he's holding up our coasters.
Yeah,
They're
coaster.
flower-shaped.
Yeah. But you can, through this, you can get into other things that are going on right now, and this would be your entry point.
And what about this point that the media is essentially dominated by some form of political and business interests? What about what I tried to raise when we had 10 questions going, which is that we live in an era when we have lots more potential within the media for changing the conversation because of the internet platforms, and social media gives us opportunities to do new things that are not controlled by anyone. You don't think that breaks down this political and corporate conspiratorial hold over our frames of reality?
Well, first of all, even just this Cambridge Analytica story, just to believe that the elections, like one day, in which you can control the ballots, not to mention the protocols, of registration and so on, which the story within the Democratic Party in the U.S. and within the U.S. Presidential elections of how, registration of certain groups is, it's not as available for other groups as it is to other groups. So, you believe that in 12 hours, open ballots, that's democracy. So, good for you. Then the manipulation of that, to believe that that is a manipulation as if the system itself is not a manipulation, these are just things that I'm far from believing in. But,
okay, so I've got
just to say, that, we can say whatever we want, depends, how the system sees us. If I'm a Israeli male, Jewish, I can pretty much say a lot of things, at least as long as I own my own apartment. If I don't, then I might have problems because, the rent's here and you have to half your salary put into that. So then what if you don't have a job for a few months?
You're saying
and that's the reality.
You're saying you could say things that would get you fired, and if you got fired, you couldn't pay the rent.
Of course. And this is all these, beautiful democracies we're speaking of.
Okay, so I've got to ask you this. So what's the point? How is resistance not futile if you, in your own work, are trying to open a crack, in the words of Leonard Cohen, right?
To let the light in.
Let the light in.
Yeah.
Well, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light comes in, right? That's
Otherwise known as the question where Gilad loses his religion.
Exactly. So what's the point of what you're doing? Your political art is meant to offer some sort of critique, some sort of resistance. But it is, just like any other form of art, dominated by the overly domineering system, the capitalist system with all the political and business interests. How can you create a space for resistance?
Right.
And why are you so happy about it? People don't see, but you're smiling a lot.
Yeah, I see everything that you just said, I see as a compliment. So there's this myth, or let's say there is this story of artists and revolutionaries, at least at the beginning of the 20th century, shoulder to shoulder, whatever. It can be Karl Kraus, famous satirist in Vienna, sitting in the same cafe as Leon Trotsky before he was Trotsky, or of course Lenin living across the street from Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich when he was in exile, where Dada started. And the interesting thing about these stories is that they tell the story of revolutionaries, who are people who think we can have another world in which we'll have new values, and artists who work within this world, in the surpluses that this world enables, to negotiate new values. So there's one moment, which is still, within, the reality that the artists can work in, that they work together. But then, of course, when the political project becomes a reality, they don't need the artists. I mean, that's what history tells us also. So
they don't need the artists, or they need them for different purposes, like propaganda?
Well, then you ask yourself, wasn't it propaganda to begin with? Like what I'm doing? I mean, am I not an agent for a different
Well, this is a very interesting philosophical
one day,
question.
Will emerge?
I mean, I think this is a very interesting philosophical question. Is art legitimately art when it criticizes the system? But if the system changes and becomes whatever the art was advocating, does it then become part of the system and co-opted and propagandist? The same product in different situations can be one or the other, is that right?
I can give you the example of the Communist Party here in Palestine. They were the only ones for a partition plan. So the Zionists were okay with them. And then after the War of 48, they were the only ones for a partition plan. And, and they were so they were not allowed to say that. So,
but they're not artists.
No, but I just mean to say that, of course, historical context changes the meaning. That's for sure. And even the words we use for liberalism or deregulation, whatever it meant in Israel 10 years ago, it means very different things today, I feel. But I will say this, there's something about prefigurative element to art, like it prefigures certain shapes, and you can put it like as a quality that is a good quality, but also maybe sometimes it is not. And I can give you an example.
Yeah, please.
So, for example, especially after the war in Yugoslavia, so it was obvious already that the New World Order is not whatever it was supposed to be. Okay, collapse of the Soviet Union, and still artists started working with what is now called reenactment. So they would reenact events from history. For example, Jeremy Deller, an English artist, reenacted famous kind of clashes between coal miners and the police in the 1980s in the UK. So he would bring professional reenactors who would do, wars as policemen with policeman gear, and those coal miners 20 years later, going back to the trauma of those battles, okay? And you had many works like that. And the question was, what is this exactly? I mean, what are we doing with this, kind of reenacting these gestures? And one nice interpretation by a German writer, Sven Lutiken, is that basically artists are trying to, within this new world order, right, within this kind of globalization and so on, they're using reenactment as a way to remember what was once, going on. So, because there's no political infrastructure anymore, no left, organized left, there's intellectual left, there's, how do you say it, like a moralist left, but there's no Communist Party. And so within this reality, they are doing that work of just kind of remembering those things that when the time comes, we can reactivate.
That's so fascinating that you mentioned former Yugoslavia, because there happens to be a Serbian film where the director, who is a well-known Serbian director, dressed up himself as Tito in the late 90s after the wars, and before Kosovo, I think, and walked around Belgrade as Tito and just filmed the reactions of people saying all sorts of things to him. So would that fall under the category of what you're talking about?
I think, for example, just the idea that what would this gesture activate, right? Documenting like someone walking like Tito in the middle of Belgrade. Definitely. So I'm saying this is just one example. Then another example, which would be kind of the flip side in a way, has to do more with the practice. So artists are no longer bound to the studio. It's not this industrial kind of, let's say, it's called light industry, kind of one person in his shop working on a painting. So also with materials that some of them are dangerous and so on, okay? This is like the tradition of the artist in the studio, atelier and so on. And it comes from, when production was actually a word that came from art and not from the economy, like, Renaissance times, when you had also followers who would work with you in your studio. Now this is not the world at all, right? This is not where we live in. These are deadline-based, project-based, ready-to-deliver entrepreneurs, artists. They answer to open calls, which are supposed to democratize, but actually this is like kind of micro jobs in a way. These models that are now, so kind of widespread in the labor market with the internet were developed in the art world, okay, like 20 years ago. And we are, again, prefiguring the reality. And so all those values that come from, we're 50 years from 1968, horizontality, creativity, all those things that were kind of calls of the revolt of 68, artists embodied, right? Against hierarchy and so on. And this has become our jail now. Everybody has to be this entrepreneur who is all the time have to be creative again and again just to keep, to make a living.
So if I understand you correctly, you're harking back to the communist infrastructure is in a way an answer to this flipping of the roles from what was once an oppressive structure. Now that the formerly liberating structure has become oppressive, the formerly oppressive structure has become a liberating one.
I don't want to go back to the Soviet Union, actually, to be honest, but I do feel, as someone who was born in the 20th century, that if there's one thing, like one resource that we are really missing, is this whole cosmos that just disappeared, vanished. I went to the Tel Aviv University for my first degree, and I had the history school, and I had a professor in Roman law. And it was obvious that something about that professor, who was great, was kind of different from the rest of the professors. And she never talked about Soviet Union or anything. But what I learned was, just a few years before, she was still a Sovietolog. But that kind of field of, science, knowledge, just disappeared, was erased, and she had to do something. She had so she will teach, Roman law. So I think that just to shoot examples at you, from the fact that coding in the Soviet Union, they were experimenting with not binary, but trinary, which is -1, 0, 1. So the -1 will be the off, the 1 would be the on, but the 0 would be both. I don't know what that means even, but it's just, this is a different world that they were offering.
No, but why communism is such a, an anchor, such a focal point for you?
Or let me try to clarify. What do you think we are lacking, having thrown off all of that? It sounds like you're basically saying, if I can put this in the layperson's terms, like we threw out some baby with the bathwater of the Soviet Union. What are we missing that you think could be revived if we got back to some of the communist thinking?
So first of all, for the left, organizational concepts, which you must understand. Also the Zionists, the one that actually controlled and, just established the state, the Labour Party, Mapai, they were about organization. They were not about a mass movement. It wasn't about huge rallies. It was about organizing institutions. And it worked very well. And by the way, also for the Soviet Union, I mean, for the Bolsheviks within, the revolution of 1917. So organization, that's a huge thing. And the party is a medium like Facebook in the sense that it is supposed to mediate information going back and forth, okay, and make a reality out of it. But that system, no one wants to know about it anymore today. So that would be one answer. But my kind of relation has to do with coming from Israel-Palestine, because the party is, it's a dialectical kind of paradoxical situation where the party is for a two-state solution.
Wait. Which party are we talking about
The Communist
now?
Party
Communist
here,
Party,
from
yes.
1919, by the way. But by opting for like a two-state solution, they're actually creating the one state because, families are formed by Jews and Arabs. Things are happening in reality. So this would be like one kind of crucial thing, I guess, for me, that is the fact that the communists are the only ones that are not ethnic separatists in the Israeli parliament. And
So it's a very local resonance for you.
yes,
Communism.
for sure, yes, communism is local everywhere.
How do you think the Communist Party in this region could cope with that contradiction in the sense that they create a universalism, right, by Jews and Arabs bonding over, all the issues that communism deals with, but on the other hand, supporting a two-state solution, which is ethnically segregated?
I agree, and that is it all has to do with the First World War and, Wilson's 14 points and all that, which was actually an anti-communist project, of course. Yeah, the aim is, for a universalist situation. But at the same time, when there is a people that defines itself as a people and wants its own sovereignty, then the Leninist dogma says that, we have to be with them. So that's why, for example, an Israeli communist would go with Palestinian bourgeois. Yeah. So Ahmed Tibi is with the communists now because it has to do with within that party, like the joint list, just because this has to do with the Leninist logic. But to say something more general, again, growing up in the 20th century and, coming of age in the 1990s, let's say, and especially today, my feeling is that actually we live in a world where different anti-communisms are fighting each other. So Wahhabism, this form of Sunnah that the Americans helped the Saudis export and so on. So like this political jihad. And on the other hand, privatizations, neoliberalism, even the internet is this war technology, like military technology, American military technology. All these things are different anti-communisms that are now it's like one big monster, anti-communism, that has different heads fighting each other. That would be my image of where we live today. So that's why I would say, okay, so let's talk about communism because the beast is already here.
But I want to ask you a question getting back to some of the maybe deeper layers of art, because at one point in one of your essays, you write that there was sort of a flourishing of a vision that Israel could be universalist in the 1990s, and that artists developed, or maybe you meant the cultural scene in general, developed a kind of universalist fantasy in the 1990s. And we're seeing a backlash against that now or something. And I'm trying to frame my question. I guess I'm questioning whether really communism is the answer, because in the 1990s, of course, I think one of the things that gave birth to that sense that Israelis could bond with the rest of the world and relate to them was privatization. We had more television channels, we had more consumerism, people had more money, they started traveling more. A communist system really the answer, or do we have to admit that on some level...
it's the opium of the masses.
Right, but on some level, don't we have to admit that a more free market economy, a less state-controlled economy, with all of the conflicts that it creates, also opened up Israel more and more to the world and gave us the very kind of universalism that it seems to me you believe is one of the foundations for a vibrant artistic world?
Well, again, you can say also, that you had those revolutionaries, let's say Netanyahu or whoever, and they were, you can even say that they were on the same side as the artists who just were like thirsty to see and be and, show and be part of those other centers. So you can say that they were on the same side. And then the revolution succeeded. Neoliberalism, Israel is the most unequal. So that's a great achievement. And then you don't need the artists anymore. It's not only the artists, entertainers and so on. The whole kind of Yeah, like you were saying, the superstructure and so on.
So maybe the answer is, and I don't know, I'm just perhaps being the devil's advocate here, is to withdraw from politics as an artist? No, because maybe the political message could come from a place that you least expected. If you just face the system head on, maybe it's not going to work.
Gilad does. Our listeners don't know this, but Gilad is actually on the payroll of the culture minister and the education minister, who would like for
Of the
art
Communist
to
Party.
have of the state of Israel, who would like for education and culture to butt out of politics.
Exactly.
They say, don't stick your nose in where you don't belong.
Exactly. Now that I've plugged my message.
No, I'm curious to hear what you think about that, because this is a big debate. What is the line between art or education or culture
No, but also in
and
terms of
politics?
practicality. I mean, when you're doing art, you're expecting it to have some sort of impact. So what's the way to maximize that impact?
I think, first of all, we should all be involved all the time. So I'm not for withdrawal at all. I do think that, the structure of the conversation to begin with, being that the media outlets and so on are such, is biased. And it's, almost impossible, actually, to bring in something else other than the repetition of messages.
Just like this podcast.
No, but I would say this. You have to engage with antagonism while withdrawing from its paradigms. So,
Help us explain that.
So, to give you an example, there's, Israel and Iran. Okay, that's an antagonism. If you go and work for the Iranians, you're still loyal to the antagonism, right? You're still loyal to the war that's going to happen, even if you committed treason, change sides.
As an Israeli, you mean?
Yeah, but the idea is to betray the loyalty of that conflict to begin with, to find another entry point. And I think, communism is a good example for that, because it's not in the conversation even.
I absolutely thought you were going to end that sentence by saying the Israel loves Iran or the I love Iran campaign was the antithesis of accepting the hostile
Exactly.
relations.
That was great. I agree. That was like, bring love in.
Is that art?
That's
art?
betraying the antagonism to begin with.
Would you
right?
call that art?
Yeah, why not? Yeah. I'll tell you what, art is a place, you have institutions, like on an institutional level, it's a place where a lot of projects take refuge because they don't have an outlet on other, let's call them platforms. That's the truth. So even the way I would interpret things within, the art world discourse, maybe it's just coding for saying something else outside. Think of, the clergy, right? Doing political work, but within its institutions, and then it has a political meaning. I don't think that art has that power, but still, that would be a way to read what's going on in the field of art.
I'd like to ask one last question. You describe in your essays about a certain measure of denial, that there's a level of social denial in Israel about the political situation. I think you specifically referred to the media finding ways not to tell certain stories. And I think, particularly when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We had Professor Gershon Shafir on this show, who wrote a book where he wrote about denialism as a means of Israel coping with, what's going on for 50 years in the Palestinian territories. Can you talk about how you think that denial has manifested itself in the Israeli cultural scene?
Of course. To give you just one example, now in Israel, you have this identity politics, very strong cultural war. People are talking about them coming from Muslim countries as opposed to those who come from Christian countries. And the interesting thing about the Zionists is that they erase their identity. I grew up, I can tell you my family, everybody has a family story, but basically I was brought up Israeli, but you just scratch a little bit, right? And, my mom knows 5 languages from where she came from, and my dad knew 5 languages from where he came from, which is actually here from Palestine. So,
and where's your mom from?
She was born in Hungary after the war to parents from Czechoslovakia who had children before the war. So, and she has and that's, how do you say it? She has cousins that one is the chief rabbi of Geneva and another of Sao Paulo. So they come from a rabbinical family, let's say, and my father's family comes from Palestine, from 17th generation. So,
yeah, goes back to Moses.
Yeah, not to Moses, to the 60s. But, those family who have this idea about, whatever, Jerusalemites. So, this has to do with this thing that the Zionists did, which is a self-erasure, let's say. Okay, so we erased our identities to create a new one, right? Israelis. And by doing that, we actually, it's even subconscious. We are inflicting this on the Palestinians. What is this politicide like this? Destruction of all political life for Palestinians. It is a reflection of our self-erasure. It's within that logic. It's, we are, some Israeli right-wing politicians might even say, we are giving them this as a present, because they can join the success of this thing called Israel.
So is it the role of the Israeli artist, the Israeli political artist, to try and restructure those bygone categories?
I don't know if that's the role, but for sure artists are interested in the Ottoman history of this region for reasons that no one is talking about. These other identities that were here, just a split second ago, and so on.
I just want to point out that every time one of us says political art, you get a big smile on your face.
And not just political art.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know what we've been smoking before we stepped into the studio, but that was very interesting.
Who's we, Paleface?
All right, Joshua Simon, thank you very much for coming in today. Your talk will be held at the Van Leer Institute on the 29th of May. All are welcome, but it will be in Hebrew, right?
Yes, in Hebrew with a panel of speakers.
Yes, a round table.
And thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Itai Shelem, our producer. And now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Just launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review, and press write a review, and then write one. You can also support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. We've got gifts and perks and extra material for you. Check out our archives with some more than 450 interviews. If you like us, please like us on Facebook too. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel. Follow Gilad and me on Twitter. And join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. Until then, goodbye.